3 months before the tragedy, a warning was already on the table. This warning didn't come after the fact. It wasn't shaped by grief. It was spoken clearly before everything collapsed. Jake Reiner didn't come forward as a devastated son looking for sympathy. He spoke as someone who had already seen the danger forming and tried to stop it. This story isn't just about what happened on December 14th. It's about what happened before and why it didn't change anything. When Jake made that call, he wasn't angry. He wasn't trying to accuse anyone. He wasn't cutting ties. He was afraid. That fear didn't come out of nowhere. It came from years of watching a situation slowly slip out of control. At that point, nothing had exploded yet. There was no crime scene, no headlines, no police tape. There was only a family living under constant pressure and a son who believed something irreversible was coming if nothing changed. Jake knew how this would sound to people on the outside. A famous family, wealth, resources, connections. From the outside, everything looked protected, stable, safe. From the inside, it wasn't. By then, Jake had already spent years learning how to spot warning signs without panicking. His entire career depended on staying calm while reporting other people's worst days. When he spoke up, it wasn't impulsive. It was measured. That's why the sentence he later said on air landed so hard. "I warned my parents beforehand." Those words weren't emotional. They were factual. And they forced one question into the open. What did he see that others didn't? According to Jake, the concern came down to one issue: boundaries. Or more accurately, the lack of them. His younger brother Nick had been struggling for years. The family had lived through cycles of hope, relapse, forgiveness, and reassurance. Each time, love filled the space where structure should have been. Jake wasn't asking his parents to give up on Nick. He wasn't asking for punishment. He wasn't asking for distance forever. He asked for caution, for time, for a pause before everything returned to the way it had been before. He didn't frame it as judgment. He framed it as fear. "I don't feel safe," he told them. That sentence wasn't about blame. It was about risk. Jake believed that letting Nick move back in without stronger boundaries was dangerous. Not only for Nick, but for everyone. He said it plainly. He didn't soften it. He didn't hide it behind optimism. He warned them that something irreversible could happen. At the time, that warning didn't trigger a crisis. There were no emergency meetings, no dramatic confrontations. The response was familiar hope, patience, and the belief that love would steady everything again. That belief had guided the family for years, and in that moment, it outweighed fear. Looking back, that call became the dividing line in this story, the moment where two paths existed, and only one was taken. Jake didn't know it then, but that warning would become the sentence people remembered most. Not because it was loud, but because it was ignored. The warning didn't disappear. It didn't fade with time. It stayed there quiet and unresolved until the night everything finally collapsed. December 14th wasn't supposed to matter. There was nothing marked on the calendar. No countdown. No sense that a breaking point had arrived. Jake Reiner was in New York, focused on work, moving through another ordinary day, in a career built on deadlines and distance. Then the call came. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't unfold slowly. There was no buildup that allowed shock to soften the impact. The words landed fast and heavy. His parents were dead. Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner had been killed inside their own home. The house where Jake had grown up. The place that once represented safety, routine, and family history. In moments like this, people expect collapse. Screaming, crying, disbelief spilling out all at once. But Jake didn't describe it that way. What followed wasn't chaos. It was stillness. A numb silence where the mind refuses to catch up with reality. And then came the second blow. Not long after the initial shock, another name entered the conversation. A name Jake never expected to hear in that context. The suspect wasn't a stranger. It wasn't an intruder. It wasn't someone from the outside. It was his younger brother, Nick Reiner. That detail changed everything. This was no longer a tragedy caused by random violence. It became something far more disturbing, something internal, a disaster that came from inside the family itself. Loss mixed instantly with disbelief, confusion, and a sense of betrayal that didn't yet have words. In that moment, Christmas disappeared. What had been imagined as a reunion turned into a void. 2 chairs at the table would never be filled again. The idea of coming home lost its meaning entirely. Jake flew back to Los Angeles almost immediately. There was no time to prepare emotionally, no gradual acceptance, just movement. Airports, flights, long stretches of silence while everything he thought he understood began to unravel. He reunited with his sister Romy. At first they barely spoke. Grief doesn't always arrive as conversation. Sometimes it shows up as shared silence, as holding on just to confirm that someone familiar still exists. Outside the family, the reaction built quickly. Rob Reiner was a public figure. His work had shaped decades of entertainment. Headlines spread fast. The story moved. But behind the public framing, Jake was dealing with something far more personal and far more complicated. Because this wasn't just about losing parents. It was about realizing that the danger he had tried to warn them about had already arrived, and no one had been able to stop it. At that stage, there were no accusations, no public blame, no demand for answers. There was only shock, grief, and a growing awareness that the warning spoken months earlier was now impossible to ignore. That was the moment the story shifted. Not from tragedy to justice, but from silence to truth. And soon Jake would say the words that forced everyone to look backward instead of forward. I warned them. Before anyone decided what Jake Reiner's words meant, there was a more important question that needed to be answered first. Who was he speaking as? Because this wasn't a relative lashing out in grief. And it wasn't a celebrity family member chasing attention after a headline. Jake wasn't raised to live in front of cameras. He was trained to stand behind the story. He built his career in journalism, local news, long hours, uncomfortable assignments, situations where emotions had to be managed, not amplified. For years, he reported on accidents, crimes, and tragedies involving strangers. His job required him to stay calm while other people's lives were falling apart. That background matters. Journalists are trained not to speculate, not to exaggerate, not to speak casually when facts aren't clear, especially on air. So when Jake appeared publicly and said, "I warned my parents beforehand," it didn't sound emotional. It sounded deliberate, measured, controlled. People who worked with him described him the same way. Steady, careful, professional. He wasn't known for dramatic language or emotional storytelling. He was known for restraint. And that restraint gave his words weight. Jake didn't point fingers wildly. He didn't deliver long speeches filled with accusations. He didn't ask the audience to take sides. He stated a fact, one that quietly reframed the entire timeline of the tragedy. This wasn't hindsight. It was foresight. That distinction matters because hindsight is common after loss. Everyone looks back and finds signs they missed. But foresight is rare, and when someone claims they saw danger before it arrived, skepticism comes naturally. Jake seemed aware of that risk. He didn't claim he knew exactly what would happen. He didn't pretend to have perfect answers. What he described was fear. Specific fear. Grounded fear. Fear built on patterns he had watched repeat for years. That's why his warning wasn't theatrical. It was practical. He wasn't predicting a crime. He was predicting instability. Risk. A situation that no longer felt safe to him. and he chose to say so even knowing how it might be received. Publicly, Jake didn't sound driven by anger. Even after the loss, his tone stayed controlled. His words didn't escalate. If anything, they forced people to slow down and reconsider what they thought they understood. Because once you understand who Jake is, the story stops being about whether he was exaggerating. It becomes about something far more uncomfortable. Why didn't his warning change anything? That question shifts the focus away from headlines and shock. And it pulls attention toward the family dynamics that had been shaping this outcome long before anyone outside was paying attention. From the outside, the Reiner family looked solid. A famous name. A creative legacy. Stability. The kind of household people assume is insulated from the chaos most families face. But inside that structure, patterns had been forming quietly for years. Nothing explosive. Nothing obvious. Just pressure building slowly over time. Jake was the oldest. And being the oldest often means learning restraint early. Not because anyone demands it directly, but because the role forms naturally. You adapt. You step back. You read the room before speaking. Over time, that adjustment becomes instinct. Nick, the youngest, was different. He was more fragile, more volatile. And as his struggles became clearer, attention shifted toward protecting him. Not out of favoritism, but out of fear. Fear that if they loosened their grip even slightly, he might slip away entirely. That fear shaped everything. When tension appeared, the instinct was to calm it. When conflict surfaced, the priority was to prevent escalation. And in that process, one voice became quieter, while another absorbed the focus. Jake learned how to disappear without leaving. He never described his childhood as abusive. He never accused his parents of neglect. What he described was something more subtle. A slow conditioning where silence felt like love and patience felt like responsibility. If Nick was upset, the household adjusted. If Nick needed space, others gave it. If Nick promised things would be different, hope filled the gaps again. Jake adjusted accordingly. At first, that adjustment didn't feel like sacrifice. It felt normal, necessary. The kind of thing families do when one member needs more support than the others. But over time, it created imbalance. The message wasn't spoken aloud, but it was understood. Don't add pressure. Don't make things harder. Don't be the problem. Jake internalized that role. He became the one who stayed composed. The one who didn't demand attention. The one who could handle things on his own. That dynamic didn't cause the tragedy, but it shaped how everyone responded when warning signs began to appear. As Nick's struggles deepened, the family entered a familiar cycle. Concern followed by hope. Progress followed by relapse. Reassurance followed by another promise. Each time, love was used as the stabilizing force, and each time boundaries softened. From Jake's perspective, this pattern wasn't just exhausting. It was dangerous. Not because anyone intended harm, but because the system relied too heavily on optimism, on the belief that care alone could correct instability. The house itself began to change. What once felt like a home started to feel tense. Conversations became cautious. Moments of calm felt temporary. Everyone learned to live around uncertainty instead of confronting it directly. Nothing exploded all at once. There were no dramatic confrontations that forced a reckoning. There was only endurance. Long-term endurance built on love, fear, and the hope that tomorrow would be better than today. Jake didn't see villains in this dynamic. He saw parents trying to save a child and slowly wearing themselves down in the process. He saw a family surviving hour by hour instead of living freely. And he saw something else. A situation where silence felt safer than intervention. Where maintaining peace mattered more than addressing risk. Where love kept postponing decisions that needed to be made. By the time Jake spoke up clearly, that pattern was already deeply embedded. And changing it would require something the family had avoided for a long time. Boundaries. As Nick got older, the problem stopped being something the family could explain away. Addiction entered the picture quietly at first. Mood changes. Sudden anger. Nights when he disappeared without warning. Nothing that made headlines. Nothing that forced immediate intervention. Just enough instability to keep everyone on edge. And once addiction takes hold, families often fall into the same pattern. They hope. They hope the next program works. They hope the next promise is real. They hope love will eventually outweigh the damage. The Reiners were no different. Each time Nick said he was trying, the family leaned in again. Each time he said things would change, belief returned. That belief wasn't naive. It was emotional. It came from parents who were terrified that drawing hard lines would push their son further away. So they softened. They defended him when others raised concerns. They explained his behavior as struggle instead of danger. They treated instability as temporary something patience could fix. From the outside, it looked compassionate. From the inside, it created constant tension. Jake watched this cycle repeat for years. He watched his parents age under the weight of it. Always alert. Always waiting for the phone to ring. Always bracing for the next crisis. The house didn't feel chaotic, but it never felt relaxed. Silence replaced conversation. Calm became something everyone waited for instead of lived in. That's when fear replaced hope for Jake. He didn't fear his brother as a person. He feared the situation, the unpredictability, the lack of structure, the absence of firm limits. To him, this wasn't about love versus abandonment. It was about safety versus risk. Jake saw something his parents struggled to accept. Absorbing chaos without boundaries doesn't make it disappear. It concentrates it. For parents, that realization is brutal, because it forces a choice no one wants to make. Protect the family as a whole or continue rescuing one person at any cost. Rob and Michelle chose hope. They believed supervision could manage risk. They believed being present could replace structure. They believed that keeping Nick close would help him stabilize. Jake didn't see it that way. He believed proximity without control increased danger, that familiar environments made old patterns easier to repeat, that bringing instability back into the home didn't reset the problem. It magnified it. This difference in perspective mattered. Because when families face addiction, the debate usually isn't about love. Everyone loves. The debate is about limits, about how much damage can be absorbed before the system breaks. In this family, limits kept being postponed, not ignored but delayed, put off for later, framed as something that could wait until things improved. Jake didn't think they would, and that's why when Nick began talking about moving back home again, Jake didn't feel hopeful. He felt alarmed. To him, that wasn't progress. It was a return to the most dangerous version of the situation. The one where fear was managed with optimism and risk was hidden behind compassion. At that point, Jake believed the family was approaching a line. And this time, he wasn't willing to stay silent. 3 months before the killings, the situation shifted. Nick began talking about coming back home. To his parents, that sounded like progress, stability, a chance to keep him close, to supervise, to help him reset in a familiar environment. It fit the pattern they had relied on for years. When things became unstable, bring him closer. To Jake, it sounded like danger. This wasn't instinct without context. It wasn't vague fear. It was based on everything he had already seen. The cycles, the volatility, the way proximity without structure had failed before. Jake didn't wait. He picked up the phone. What followed wasn't a fight. It wasn't emotional chaos. It was a controlled, deliberate warning. Jake later said his hands were shaking as he spoke. Not because he was angry, but because he was afraid of saying the wrong thing, and even more afraid of staying silent again. He told his parents he didn't feel safe. That sentence wasn't dramatic. It wasn't exaggerated, but it carried weight. Jake wasn't talking about discomfort. He was talking about risk. He asked them not to let Nick move back in. Not permanently, not forever. He asked them to slow down, to pause, to put boundaries in place before bringing instability back into the home. He explained why. Nick's behavior had become unpredictable. The emotional swings were sharper, the control issues more visible. Jake wasn't diagnosing anything. He wasn't speculating. He was describing patterns he had watched repeat for years. Then he said the part that mattered most. He told them he was afraid that something irreversible could happen. Not someday. Not abstractly. Soon. This wasn't a threat. It wasn't a prophecy. It was a warning grounded in fear and observation. Jake didn't claim he knew what would happen. He said he knew what could. And when families hear warnings like that, the instinct isn't always to act. Often it's to reassure, to calm, to protect hope. That's exactly what happened. Rob and Michelle didn't dismiss Jake. They didn't mock his concern. They listened. But they didn't change course. They responded the way they always had, with compassion. They believed supervision would be enough. They believed being present would help. They believed that family closeness could stabilize the situation. And they believed something else as well. That turning Nick away or even delaying his return might push him further into isolation, might make things worse, might break trust. So they chose to keep the door open. Jake pushed once more. He reminded them of past incidents. He talked about volatility. He spoke about the toll the years had already taken. He didn't accuse anyone of failure. He framed everything as prevention. If not for me, he said, then for yourselves. That was the line he hoped would change things. It didn't. The decision wasn't made in anger. It wasn't dramatic. It was made quietly, the same way most decisions in this family had been made for years. Hope won again. When the call ended, nothing felt resolved. There was no explosion, no clear winner, just the familiar weight of unresolved tension. Jake didn't feel relieved. He felt uneasy. Because in that moment, he understood something clearly. He had done everything he could. He had spoken plainly. He had asked for boundaries. He had warned them of risk. And once that line was crossed, the outcome, whatever it would be, was no longer in his control. 3 months later, the phone rang again. And this time, there would be no warning left to give. After the killings, Jake Reiner didn't rush to speak. He didn't post statements. He didn't give interviews filled with outrage. For a time, he stayed quiet, trying to process something no one is ever prepared to process. But grief doesn't stay still. It changes shape. When Jake finally spoke publicly, the words weren't new. They weren't improvised. They were the same words he had already spoken months earlier, now stripped of hope and weighed down by consequence. I warned them. This time the sentence landed differently. It wasn't preventative anymore. It was historical. A line drawn between what might have been and what could never be changed. At first, anger took over. Jake didn't hide it. He didn't soften it. He said his brother had destroyed their family, that he had taken their parents away, that the warning had been ignored, and now 2 people were dead. Viewers could hear it in his voice. This wasn't theatrical grief. It was fractured, uneven, the kind that comes when shock fades and reality sets in. But anger didn't last. It turned inward. Jake began questioning himself. He replayed the call from 3 months earlier. He wondered if different words would have mattered, if pushing harder would have changed the outcome, if flying home sooner would have altered the timeline. Guilt doesn't ask whether responsibility is fair. It asks whether anything at all could have been done differently. And then the phone rang. Jake knew who it was before he answered. Nick was calling from jail. The voice on the other end didn't sound like the person described in headlines. It sounded panicked, desperate, unstable. Nick spoke quickly, afraid silence would end the call. He insisted he hadn't meant for things to go this far, that everything spiraled, that everything went wrong. Then came the request. Nick asked Jake to help post bail, $4 million. The number hit hard. Not because of the amount, but because of what it represented. A chance to pull his brother out of custody. A chance to intervene one last time. A chance to step back into the role he had carried his entire life. Nick pleaded. He said he couldn't survive inside. He said Jake was the only one he had left. For a long moment, Jake said nothing. In that silence, two realities collided. On one side was loyalty. The brother he had protected, defended, and adjusted for since childhood. On the other side was truth. Two parents who would never walk out of that house. Two lives that could not be restored. A warning that had already been ignored once. When Jake finally spoke, his voice wasn't loud. It was exhausted. "I can't," he said. He told Nick he couldn't use money to run from the truth. That he couldn't undo what had already happened. That saving him this way wasn't saving anyone. Nick exploded in anger. He accused Jake of betrayal, of abandonment, of turning his back like everyone else. The same emotional patterns resurfaced under pressure, exactly as Jake had feared for years. Jake didn't argue. He didn't shout back. "I'm not abandoning you," he said, "but I can't save you like this." That was the line. Not just between two brothers, but between the past and whatever came next. When the call ended, there was silence. Jake stared at the dark screen, unsure whether the decision was right or wrong. All he knew was this: sometimes love is not enough to save someone, and realizing that might be the cruelest punishment of all. When the story finally reached the public, it didn't explode the way tragedies usually do. There were no shouting matches on television, no loud arguments, no rush to turn grief into spectacle. Instead, there was silence. The kind that settles in when people realize they are witnessing something deeply personal and deeply irreversible. Viewers didn't react with outrage. They reacted with discomfort. Many said they couldn't breathe while watching. Others admitted they turned the TV off only to turn it back on minutes later, unable to walk away, yet afraid to keep watching. This wasn't a reporter delivering the news. It was a son standing inside it. Jake never framed his words as an attack. He didn't demand punishment. He didn't ask for sympathy. What he offered instead was something far harder to accept, a warning shaped by regret. He spoke because staying silent felt worse. He spoke because the fear he had carried for years was now a reality no one could undo. And if his pain could serve any purpose at all, it was to prevent another family from reaching the same breaking point. The message was simple but brutal. Love by itself is not always enough. Families facing addiction often cling to hope because the alternative feels unbearable. Setting boundaries feels like abandonment. Delaying hard decisions feels kinder than making them. But sometimes kindness without limits becomes dangerous. Jake never claimed to have perfect answers. He didn't pretend to know how everything should have been handled. What he showed was this: ignoring fear doesn't make it disappear. It pushes it forward until the consequences are unavoidable. The warning he gave his parents came too early to be taken seriously. Now it comes too late to change anything for them, but not for others. That is why Jake chose to speak publicly. Not to relive the tragedy, but to stop it from repeating elsewhere. To remind families that listening matters, that discomfort matters, that boundaries matter. Some mistakes don't offer second chances, some warnings don't come twice, and some Christmases never come again.